All right, so this is going to be a video about feedback. Something I've noticed recently looking through my DMs is I get a lot of feedback, right? People saying, hey, this champion doesn't feel good, or hey, this thing is, really cool, or hey, I wish this item system worked a little differently, or like this thing doesn't work as well as it used to, whatever, right? And I kind of realized, hey, a lot of the things that people tell me are some of the mistakes or misunderstandings that I used to have in my feedback. Right, I used to work on the game analysis team. That's how I got my start at Riot. And one of the main outputs of GAT is to give feedback, and I certainly got a lot better as I worked on the team. And so I thought it might be useful for me to do a little presentation to try and give some quick tips and some do's and don'ts on feedback for specifically players to devs, because I want this presentation to be fast, sweet, digestible. So I'm not going to go into dev to dev. If people want to hear about other types of feedback or want me to go into more detail, I'm happy to entertain the idea of doing other presentations. But I'm going to try a fast, short presentation this time, or video. So let's talk about what we're trying to get out of it, right? Like, as a player, what are you trying to get out of it? You want to be understood, right? You want to be able to communicate your ideas, like what you're thinking, to a dev and have them understand and be able to have that understanding and use that in their process designing the game, right? Or working on the game. Um, from the dev perspective, what I'm looking for talking to a player is your unique perspective. You are a unique person. You are the only person who has your experiences, your perspective, your thought process, right? These things are what we're looking for, or what I'm looking for as a game designer when I'm talking to a player. Because there is nowhere else I can get your perspective, right? And so because of that, that is the most valuable thing, right? There might be other useful things, but this is number one, like always going to be the number one priority. Is I want to hear about your perspective, because if I want to get the average Ezreal player's perspective, I will go get a data scientist to go do a survey, and they'll tell me what that is, right? If I want to ask this specific question to random Ezreal players or whatever. And so what we're looking for on both sides, the most beneficial thing is if you can explain what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what your experiences are. So let's talk about some quick do's. Be concise, right? This is one of the number one mistakes I see in feedback that people send me. Is it's just really, really long. In fact, a lot of the time it's long and making a pretty simple point. Sometimes it's long and making a fairly complex, highly dense point. But the reality is, I have a limited amount of time, right? I think I estimated in order to catch up to my DMs just from this week, I'd have to spend like 2.5 hours reviewing DMs. That's not going to happen. And so I'm never going to catch up on my DMs. So the DMs that are much more likely to get addressed and, something that for me to actually like get in, understand, analyze, digest, and put that into my brain, that, a short, concise statement of feedback is way more likely to work for that than a really long one, right? This is not to say that I never read long DMs. I do. And it's not to say that I could never get any value out of them. I do. But something that's really short is way more likely to get sort of metabolized by me as a dev than something that's long. And one of the reasons for that is if I'm looking at, hey, I have 12 DMs over here that are all, 5 sentences or less, and then I have one DM over here that is, 60 sentences, right? I'm going to probably go for the 12 DMs that are shorter, right? That's, roughly, it's probably, I don't know, a similar amount of time. In fact, it actually might be less time to go through the 12, probably. And I'm probably going to get more total value out of it, right? It's a better use of my time, right? And so even if you have a really complex point, that's the kind of thing where if you have a really compelling, long, argument or point that you want to make that's about, driven from your personal experiences, that's fine. But let that be part of a conversation and not, don't open with that for sure, because the reality is if you open with 863 words of text or whatever, I'm probably not going to pay that much attention to that. Like it's much more likely to get ignored or to get deprioritized because it's just going to be less valuable per time that I spend reading feedback. Another thing is keep focusing on your personal experiences, right? Like I said, the value here is in your experiences, right? Don't tell me about, the time that you were watching your favorite pro player and they did this thing, and you didn't like that, right? It's totally fine if you want to add context of like, yeah, I was watching my friend play Aurora and they did this thing and it looked cool. So I did it and, I had this experience, right? That's fine. If you want to add a little context, there's nothing wrong with that at all. But at the end of the day, everything should be grounded in your personal experiences, right? Because that's where the value is coming from here. As a player talking to a dev, the value comes from your experiences, right? Not from a conglomeration of I watched 50 games of pro play and decided this, right? If I wanted that kind of analysis that could be done, there are literally professional analysts that can do that at Riot. And so if I wanted that analysis, I could have that. What I can't have is your personal experiences, right? And so that's where the value is going to come from. Use historical context. This can be really useful where, someone tells me, hey, I've had a, worst time playing this champion recently. I don't know when, but, in the past, I used to do A, B, and C. And nowadays, when I do A, I can't get to B because, this thing has changed, or I'm not exactly sure why, but it changed around this time. Or, hey, when I interact with this item system back in the day, this thing used to happen, but now when I do it, usually this thing doesn't happen. And instead I get, this other result that is not as fun for me or less deep of an experience or whatever, right? Historical context can be extremely useful around like trying to help me understand and help you understand like exactly like what is the point of feedback here, right? And this doesn't have to be complaints, to be clear, right? Like you can always send me positive feedback too. You don't have to just complain. Another thing is be reasonable, right? I've gotten multiple DMs, like, for example, when we were about to ship this season, I got multiple people DMing me telling me I can't ship Bastion Breaker at this ratio. I don't know. It seems like I can, right? I've gotten all sorts of DMs telling me, that, you must rework this thing or, like, hey, look, let's give this thing some time, right? Like a lot of times people, I think, get up in arms. I get feedback about things immediately, like the day they're on live or, the first week something is on live. And it's like, let's give it some time, maybe your concerns will manifest. I think a question to ask yourself when you're giving feedback to a dev is, do you think that your feedback will be different a month from now, right? Do you think that it'll be different a year from now? And I'm not saying that you can't send it if the answer is yes, it might be different, but keep that in mind and think about like, hey, do you think that the feedback might be more pointed and have, more relevant experiences that would be useful for the conversation and for the point of feedback if you waited a week and go played some more games, or, you waited a month and, you had some of these experiences over and over again, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Let's talk about some do nots. Do not send a 43-page document. I have been through about half of the DMs that I've gotten over the past week, and I have gotten 5 documents that are all, I think, over 5 pages. I think all of them were over 6 pages. I think the longest one was 23 pages, which is a lot. And I will be honest with you, I'm not going to read them. They could be really high quality. They could be great. But number one, I don't really believe that people are going to write 23 pages of their personal experiences, which is what I would want. And again, if I wanted that kind of analysis, there are other places I could get that from, people who literally are paid to do that, who are professionals at that sort of thing. And so the reality is, do not send super long documents because for the most part, they're probably not going to get read. They're probably not going to get addressed. They're just not that useful. And, it is what it is, right? I know some people really like writing documents. I'm not telling you to stop writing them if you really want to do that. But I am telling you that if you're sending them to me as a point of feedback, it's not that likely to get addressed, or it's not that likely for me to actually digest and spend time consuming that content and trying to factor that in, because a lot of times, for one, like in the past when I did read a lot of these documents, I'll be honest with you, I find that these things often go off the rails from the very, first sentence, right? A lot of times people have a fundamental misunderstanding of like what a game mechanic is supposed to do or what a champion is supposed to do. And in fact, most of the time I would say I read these documents, they're really not even they're just, they make some incorrect assumption at the very beginning, and that doesn't even matter how high the quality of the analysis or the writing is from that point on. They've made an incorrect assumption from the very beginning, and it just isn't useful to anyone, right? Even if I were inclined to spend hours of my free time reading these kinds of player written documents, which I'm not. Another thing is, don't try to represent a group. This is something that happens fairly commonly. Someone comes to me, they say, hey, I spend a lot of time on the, whatever main subreddit or this Discord for, mains of this champion or this role or whatever. And, we all think this thing. First of all, I have no way of verifying if that's true or not. Well, I could go there myself, I guess, and try to verify it. But even if I knew for a fact that that was true or false, what you were saying, which if I wanted that information, I would, go there and, go to that community and get that information myself. To make sure that it's not only accurate, but also that I'm getting exactly the kind of information that I'm looking for. Um, Even if I could verify it, which I probably can't, um, that information probably isn't that relevant, right? The earlier example I was talking about is like, if I want the average, the opinion of an average Ezreal player, that's going to come from a data scientist who does a survey or does some other kind of data collection, right? Not from a collection of mains that is never going to be a representative sample, right? Social media is not a good place to collect actual opinions of an average player of whatever, right? The social media is always going to be extreme outlier opinions, right? You can look up studies that have been done on this, for example, right? Like even Reddit as an example is particularly sharp on this, where the algorithm on Reddit is not designed to put posts in front of you that are actually representative of the average user of that subreddit's opinion. They are actually designed to put things in front of you that you're likely to click, which is far more likely to be the extreme outlier opinions, right? I'm not going to get into that. But basically TLDR is social media is not very useful for getting reads on what an actual player of the champion who is average thinks. They might be good for a specific subgroup, right? In some extreme outlier cases, you have a X main subreddit that consists of a bunch of masters and GM one tricks of Wukong or whatever, right? I have no idea. Sure, that might be good for a very specific subsection of the population, but in general, if I want those opinions, I will go get them myself. Again, the unique thing that you're bringing to the table is your perspective, not, hey, here, I talked to a bunch of people and here's their perspective. Because if I want their perspective, I will go get it myself or have someone else do it for me who is professional at it. Another thing not to do, being overly negative. This happens from time to time, not super often, to be honest, but it's definitely a do not where, it's totally fine to be frustrated. And it's totally fine to say like, hey, the state of this thing is degraded, right? There's 172 champions in League. I have no idea how many items we have, but it's a really high number. Things will degrade, right? We can't pay attention simultaneously to every single thing in the game perfectly on every single patch, right? Things will be degraded, right? And things will, not be at the highest quality. That will happen from time to time, right? That's just reality is we just have a lot of stuff in League and that's going to happen. However, there is a difference between, hey, this thing has degraded and this experience has degraded or this champion is degraded and, I'm having a frustrating time or I don't think this is fun anymore or whatever. There's a very big difference between saying something like that and, hey, this change is shit and you need to change it. You need to revert this immediately, right? That kind of thing is just going to get ignored. Like, I don't even care if I'm the one who did that change, right? It's like, keep in mind, all the things that are on League of Legends, every single change that's ever been done has been done by a real person who is trying their best. They are trying to make the game better. And keep in mind, they may have had goals that you aren't aware of. They may have had assumptions that you weren't aware of, or they may have had constraints that you weren't aware of, right? Just keep an open mind coming into this. Don't be overly negative because I'm just going to ignore those types of feedback, and I think other devs probably will too. And final do not point here is do not set expectations or do not try to set expectations for the dev, right? We both come into this with no hard rules, right? I can't promise you things as a dev. You can't promise me anything. Do not try to make me promise you things, right? When people start using language like you must or you should or you need to do this thing, I start getting suspicious because this kind of language, whether it's intentional or not, is manipulative, right? It's the kind of thing that's trying to create a sense of false urgency in me or a sense of false gravity or in some cases like false dichotomy, right? Like where it's trying to you're trying to make me promise you something, right? Again, and sometimes I think this is unintentional, but don't try to set expectations for what I am going to do, right? The exchange of feedback is you are providing me with your perspective, right? That's where the value is coming from, not you are trying to set expectations for me, right? And so if you do hold to these do's and do nots, I think your feedback will be better. Anyway, this is it. This is the end of the presentation. It's going to be a really short, fast video. Hopefully people will like it. If not, you can just tell me. Yeah, thanks for watching and have a good time writing feedback. If you want to DM me, feel free to, but I do not guarantee that I'll read it. Thanks.